This is not a normal ghost town. Deep in the Cassia Mountains of northern British Columbia, paved roads still cut through the trees. They turn at old intersections, then stop at empty concrete pads where houses should be. Cassiar once held about 1,500 people, homes, schools, medical services, recreation, and the daily routines that make a place feel permanent. Now the town is mostly absence. Above the empty grid sits a grey mine scar. Nearby are asbestos tailings, the remains of the operation that once paid for everything below. Then in 1992, the mining company went bankrupt and the town itself entered liquidation. Records and local accounts indicate that in months, much of Cassiar was stripped from the map rather than simply left to decay. So the question is not just why Cassiar died, it is why a modern company town became something to remove. The trail begins with what the records and the ground still show. Cassiar was not erased by one secret order or one decision in a dark room. The trail is colder, a valuable mineral, a dependent town, a collapsing market, bankruptcy, and liability. The mine came first, pale chrysotile asbestos, useful enough to be called white gold. The town followed, a full community in a place so remote it made little sense without the company behind it. Then the market turned and asbestos stopped looking like a miracle material and started looking like legal and financial risk. Finally came liquidation, when houses, public buildings, and streets became assets to sell, costs to remove, or hazards no one wanted to inherit. The proof is scattered across maps, company histories, geological reports, bankruptcy records, former resident accounts, and what is still visible on the ground: the empty grid, the mine scar, the tailings, and the roads that survived after the buildings did not. Before we can understand why Cassiar was dismantled, we have to rebuild what was there. On the town map, the empty grid fills back in. The asbestos deposit was found around 1950 in the Cassiar Mountains of northern British Columbia, close enough to the Yukon border that the map begins to feel like an edge. Commercial production began in 1953, and almost immediately the mine created a problem or alone could not solve. Workers could not simply commute to a place like this, so Cassiar was built as a company town. Not a rough camp of tents and shacks, but a planned community with streets, houses, utilities, and public buildings laid out around the needs of the mine. At its height, roughly 1,500 people lived here. Families raised children here. Kids went to school here. There were medical services for injuries, illness, childbirth, and ordinary emergencies in an isolated town. There were stores, clubs, and civic routines that made the settlement feel less like a work site and more like a small northern municipality. The details matter because they later disappeared. A theater, a hockey arena, a ski hill, recreation halls, and community spaces that turned a remote industrial operation into a social world. But Cassiar's warmth came with a condition built into its design. The company was not one employer among many. It was the reason the roads were there, the houses had occupants, and services could exist so far from larger towns. The school, the rink, the clinic, the homes, all of it depended on a single mine and on a single mineral pulled from the mountain beside it. The mineral holding that whole town together was chrysotile asbestos, and for much of the 20th century, it could make an impossible place look practical. Up close, chrysotile does not behave like ordinary stone. It separates into pale, flexible fibers, fine enough to be processed, strong enough to be woven or mixed into other materials, and naturally resistant to heat. Those properties made it useful after the Second World War: insulation around pipes and boilers, fire-resistant building products, brake linings, cement sheets, gaskets, coatings, and materials meant to survive heat, friction, or wear. Cassier's deposit was prized because the fibers were long and high grade. Longer fibers were easier to process and more valuable to manufacturers, especially where strength and consistency counted. The mountain beside the town was a source of material that factories, construction firms, and heavy industry still wanted in enormous quantities. That is what made the distance worth paying for. Roads could be pushed through the north because the ore had a buyer. A mill could be built because the fiber had a market. Houses, paychecks, stores, schools, and recreation halls could exist because each shift converted remote mountain material into export revenue. In that era, asbestos was treated as a miracle material, white gold pulled from grey rock. Cassiar was the human infrastructure around that belief. A town built so the mineral could keep moving from the mountain through the mill into the wider industrial economy. But the same fibers that made chrysotile valuable were also why the story could not stay a boom story forever. The warning sign was hidden in the same feature that made asbestos useful: the fiber itself. When asbestos containing material is intact, the risk is not the same as dust hanging in the air, but when the material is mined, milled, cut, crushed, drilled, or allowed to break down, microscopic fibers can become airborne. They are small enough to be breathed deep into the body and durable enough that the body does not easily clear them. By the late 20th century, the scientific and public health consensus had hardened around a brutal conclusion: asbestos exposure was associated with severe diseases, including asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma. These were not instant effects. They could appear years, even decades after exposure, which made the material especially dangerous in workplaces where dust had been treated as part of the job. That changed the economics of asbestos. A product once sold for strength and fire resistance was now surrounded by warning labels, exposure limits, compensation claims, lawsuits, insurance problems, and bans or restrictions in one country after another. Builders looked for substitutes, governments tightened rules, buyers began treating asbestos as legal risk. For a diversified industrial company, that shift is painful. For a one-product company town in the Cassiar Mountains, it threatens the school, the houses, the roads, the entire map. Cassiar did not have a second economy waiting behind the mine. The school, arena, clinic, stores, company houses, and road connection all depended on one chain staying intact, or out of the mountain, fiber through the mill, buyers on the other end. As the world turned against asbestos, every link became harder to defend. The mineral was still in the ground. Families were still living around the shift schedule. But on the balance sheet, Cassier's white gold was becoming a controversial commodity tied to long-term health liability, shrinking markets, and rising costs. Then the mine ran into a problem inside the mountain itself. For decades, Cassiar had justified its isolation because the mountain could be mined in a way that made the numbers work. The open pit was brutal and exposed but direct. Remove rock, reach the asbestos bearing ore, process the fiber, ship it out. By the early 1990s, that open pit equation was no longer enough. The remaining future of the operation depended on going underground, driving tunnels into the mountain, and building systems for access, ventilation, safety, haulage, and production. That kind of transition is expensive in any mine. In Cassiar, it had to be financed at the end of a long northern road for a product that banks and investors could now see carrying lawsuits, regulation, shrinking demand, and public health controversy. The company was not only asking for money to keep mining, it was asking investors to fund a more expensive future around a product already carrying legal risk. That is the turn. Cassiar did not fail because one warning label appeared or because one market disappeared overnight. It failed because pressures arrived together. The open pit advantage was fading. The underground plan needed financing, operating costs remained high, and asbestos was becoming harder to defend as a long term investment. In February 1992, Cassiar Mining Corporation declared bankruptcy after failing to secure the financing it needed. On paper, that was the collapse of a mining company. On the ground, the bankruptcy stamp did not stop at the edge of the pit, it cracked through the town map itself. Once bankruptcy hit, Cassiar stopped being treated like a town waiting for another future. It became inventory. Houses, trailers, service buildings, equipment, fixtures. The pieces of a town were sorted through liquidation records, auction lists, and removal decisions. If something still had value, it could be sold. Some homes were reportedly bought for very little and hauled away from the mountain on trucks, leaving clean rectangles where kitchens, bedrooms, and front steps had been. Other structures were different. They were too costly to move, too uncertain to keep, or too tied to the liabilities of an insolvent asbestos operation. Those came down. Between late 1992 and 1993, Cassiar's town site was officially closed, and much of what remained was demolished, bulldozed, or burned. That is what makes Cassiar different from the ghost towns people imagine. In many abandoned mining towns, buildings are left to sag through winters, roofs cave in, windows break, paint peels, and tourists can still point to the hotel, the schoolhouse, the company store. Cassiar did not get that afterlife. The record does not need a secret government operation to explain this. The mechanism was colder and more ordinary. Bankruptcy law, asset sales, liability management, and a remote town attached to a product that had become legally and financially toxic. Once the company could no longer support the town, the houses were not protected civic heritage. The arena was not an independent institution. The roads, pipes, lots, and buildings became obligations attached to an insolvent industrial estate. That is the weakness hidden inside the company town promise. Cassiar looked permanent because it had schools, streets, recreation halls, medical services, and families planning ordinary lives. But almost every anchor tied back to a single corporate balance sheet. When that balance sheet failed, the town map emptied block by block. A sold house became a vacant pad. A building too costly to preserve became debris. A street that once connected neighbors became a road between absences. By the time liquidation was finished, Cassiar had not merely been abandoned, it had been reduced to the outline of where a town used to stand. This is why Cassiar feels so strange now. The town was removed. The consequences were not. What remains is not a picturesque main street or a row of weathered houses. It is flatter, quieter, and harder to read. Concrete pads sit where rooms used to be. Paved roads still curve through the site, but many no longer arrive anywhere. From above, the old town grid looks less like a ruin than a faint imprint pressed into the ground. Then the view pulls outward. Beyond the empty pads is the mine itself, the open pit scar cut into the mountain, the waste rock, and the pale tailings left by decades of asbestos production. Those tailings matter because asbestos is not dangerous only as a word in an old product catalog. The hazard comes from fibers small enough to become airborne when material is broken, dried, crushed, or disturbed. In that form, asbestos can be inhaled, and long-term exposure is why the mineral became so heavily regulated. That does not mean Cassiar should be described as a place where a single glance is fatal. That turns a real industrial hazard into a ghost story. The useful truth is practical. Abandoned asbestos mine sites can contain materials that should not be kicked up, handled, collected, or driven through for curiosity, and asbestos is only one part of the risk. Old mine landscapes can hide unstable ground, steep pit edges, contaminated dust, rusted metal, open water, and roads never meant to function as public attractions after closure. The absence of buildings can make the place look simplified, but it has not made it safe. Cassier's afterlife is evidence, not a destination. The warning sign, empty road, concrete foundation, and pale mine waste all point to the same thing. Demolition removed the town's visible shell, but it did not erase the industrial bargain that created it. That is the bargain Cassia leaves behind. Not a mystery with a hidden door, but a chain of decisions that made sense until the bill came due. The asbestos deposit made a town in the mountains economically possible. Global demand turned white fiber into wages, houses, classrooms, a rink, a theatre, and roads cut into remote northern British Columbia. Then the same mineral entered a different age. Health evidence hardened. Regulation and lawsuits changed the market. Demand weakened. The mine faced a costly underground future. Financing did not arrive, and bankruptcy turned homes and civic buildings into assets, liabilities, and cleanup problems. Cassiar was built inside the logic of the asbestos boom and erased inside the logic of the liability era. That is what makes the empty roads unsettling. They are not ruins in the usual sense. They are the outline of something deliberately removed. A town reduced to pads, scars, tailings, and memory beneath the map. Company towns can look permanent. Cassiar did too. But when one resource pays for every street light, every schoolroom, and every roof, permanence can depend on a single balance sheet. And when that balance sheet turns toxic, even the town can become part of the aftermath. This was Cassiar, an erased town in the rusted empire.